is Doug Farrar, NFL writer for Sports Press Northwest. Once again joined by our good friend Rob Rang, Senior Draft Analyst for NFLDraftScout.com. And Rob, I want to switch to another topic of severe need for the Seahawks right now, defensive end and the many different permutations of the end position for the Seahawks and in this draft class. Obviously, when Red Bryant got hurt mid-season in the Raiders game, the running defense fell apart. Pete Carroll kind of put things back together with Chris Clemens and Raheem Brock in more of a traditional four-man front with two rush ends and different tackle spots. But going forward, I mean, Clemens and Brock are both in their 30s. Red Bryant's injury history probably informs the fact that they need someone to fill that big five-tech role in the 3-4-4-3 kind of hybrid defense that Pete Carroll runs. So I wanted to go over the end position overall, and the first thing we have to say is that this is maybe the best defensive line draft class ever.
And that's a bold statement, but it is a spectacular draft class of defensive linemen. There is no questioning that the Seahawks are going to have lots of options at 25 for if they decided to go with a defensive lineman. In my opinion, the top defensive lineman in terms of stopping the run, which is of course what every Seahawks fan is hoping that they start off with, is Phil Taylor, the defensive tackle from Baylor. He could potentially be off the board, but if he's available, then he makes some sense. Another defensive tackle that makes a lot of sense, more of a traditional three technique, who's a penetrator inside, especially if the Seahawks are unable to re-sign Brandon Mebane. Makes a lot of sense. Is Illinois junior Corey Legit, a player that, you know, when I speak to NFL teams, they tell me that he's a lot closer rated to the Nick Fairleys and Marcel Darius of the world than a lot of people believe. He is a guy that I believe should be drafted in that 15 to 20 range, but if he, again, slid down the Seahawks at 25, then he'd make a lot of sense. And that might be one of those players that they would potentially take over an offensive tackle or quarterback, other positions of potentially bigger need for the Seahawks. So those are the defensive tackles that jump out at me. Muhammad Wilkerson, another defensive tackle from Temple. I really think that where he fits in best, he could be the defensive tackle, but I also like him as that five technique you mentioned. If the Seahawks are not comfortable with the rehabilitation of Red Bryant, Muhammad Wilkerson is the player who most reminds me of Red Bryant in this year's draft class. 6'5", 310 pounds, very long arms. He's going to be able to handle the double team blocks at that five technique spot, be able to allow your linebackers to go up there and clean up against the running game. Not going to give you a great deal of pass rush, but he's a very intense player. He pursues hard laterally down the field, so that makes a lot of sense for the Seahawks at that spot. Should they elect to go with a defensive lineman, there are a couple of players that intrigue me. I'm a big fan of Adrian Claiborne from Iowa. A little bit undersized. There are some concerns about his health, but when I watch him on tape, he is one of the more consistent players in this year's draft. He was a superstar as a junior, came back for his senior season. Everybody in the world knew he was a superstar, and therefore he was the focus of every opponent's blocking scheme, and so he wasn't quite as productive as a senior as he was as a junior, but I still see a very safe player who has the intangibles that you're looking for, that the Seahawks have made a priority in the past. Ryan Kerrigan, a defensive end from Purdue, who some teams believe can be a 3-4 rush linebacker. He makes a great deal of sense as well, just because he's a very productive player. So if the Seahawks are looking for a slightly undersized player, you mentioned with Chris Clemens, Raheem Brock, more of that mold. He is a fantastic sack man. He forced 7 fumbles the last couple of years. So he's a guy that can absolutely make plays behind the line of scrimmage. So he just kind of gives you an idea of the variety of options the Seahawks could be looking for, or could be looking at the number 25 spot in this year's draft.
Well, let's talk about Kerrigan first, because we mentioned DeMarcus Love in the offensive line video, and I think DeMarcus Love still has nightmares about Kerrigan from the Senior Bowl week, certainly, and in the game too. If he's there at 25, which we don't, I mean, is he the best traditional four-man front pass rusher, taking out all the five tech and this guy moving here and hybrid stuff?
In this year's draft class total? I think that he's certainly among them. You know, for me, Robert Quinn, defensive end from North Carolina, who of course missed his past season.
Yeah, and is not going to be there at 25.
Certainly is not. It certainly is not. And so that's Quinn's explosive burst off the snap is just beyond compare in this year's class. But you know, Ryan Kerrigan is an instinctive player. He plays with a lot of intensity. So he's, in my opinion, the safest of this year's elite pass rushers. And so, quite frankly, I'd be surprised to see him available to the Seahawks at number 25, but you never know. I mean, sometimes everybody gets caught up in all the athletic drills and things like that, and so you start to see players that drop down their lap. He would make a great deal of sense for the Seahawks.
Now, you mentioned Phil Taylor, who's an intriguing guy to me because he's just enormous. He's built like a nose tackle, a very tall nose tackle, but he has 3-tech mobility, and we saw that at the Senior Bowl, where he was among the most the defensive tackles with the most ability to just move around and be agile.
Absolutely. That's what makes him a unique player. I mean, we saw this a couple of years ago when the Green Bay Packers selected B.J. Raji, a defensive tackle from Boston College, who came in and has been a very effective player for them on the nose, and as well as slid outside the 5 technique. It's just rare movement skills for a man who's 340 pounds to be able to move as quickly as he does is impressive. Now, the concern with Taylor, as with a lot of players who are 340 pounds, is going to be conditioning. It's going to be work ethic. Do they have the ability to come in and be a dominant player, snap in, snap out? And that's something that he struggled with throughout his career at Baylor. But at the same time, if you hit on him, you could have one of the dominant run stuffers in the draft, and also a player who's able to give you at least a little bit in the pass rush as well.
Now, before we talk about the hybrid guys, and there seem to be 27 of them that could go in the first round. It's just the 6'4", 280 guys, the kind of Lawrence Jackson build with more or less success potential. I did want to touch on Marvin Austin, because if you're talking about a standard 1-tech, 3-tech in a 4-man front, all the other stuff aside, he seems to be, and he's very, very raw, but seems to have peerless upside.
No, he really does. He's a talented football player. And Marvin Austin, of course, like Robert Quinn, was suspended for the entire 2010 season. But had he not been suspended and had the type of season that we all expected based on his sophomore and junior tape at North Carolina, you'd be talking about top 20 pick. I mean, easily. Potentially a top 10 pick. I mean, this is a guy that has everything you're looking for. At the same time, he was suspended for the year. He only had 1 game this past season, and that was when he was allowed, surprisingly, to participate in the East-West Shrine game. He had a strong week of practice there, proved that he was the best player on the field at the East-West Shrine game during the week of practice as well as the game itself. So there's a lot of upside there. And of course, we all know that the Seahawks under Pete Carroll have shown a willingness to gamble on some players, a little bit of character. So if you're looking for a player that might be a head scratcher, a big surprise, a dark horse candidate for number 25 overall, Marvin Austin might be a player to keep in mind.
Yeah, to me, he's maybe a year or two and the right coaching system and the right team system away from being able to have like a Tommy Harris style impact. He has, to me, that potential upside. He
does have that potential upside. Of course, the concern is that he was suspended for the year. A large degree of that was because he's a player that is a little bit me first at times and doesn't necessarily abide by the rules as much as he should. And so there's also a potential that you invest a lot of money in a player like that and that he ends up being a bust because he doesn't show the work ethic. He has had a year to prepare for the combine. He was very well prepared. And so is he motivated just by the dollars, or did he truly learn something with his suspension? Is therefore going to focus his attention and be the superstar that we all know that he can become?
So let's move to the endless litany of 6'4", 280-pound guys who can maybe kick into 3-tech and nickel situations, can rush the passer in the right front, could be 3-techs in a 5-man front like a San Diego or a Dallas or whatever, and could play different styles in the Seahawks front. Your J.J. Watts, you mentioned legit. Who are the best guys around 25, and why would the Seahawks be best off drafting this or that player in that particular class?
You know, you mentioned Wisconsin's J.J. Watt. I think he's going to be long off the board at that spot. He would make a great deal of sense. Extremely versatile player, very high effort, high motor type of a player. So he would make a great deal of sense if he were somehow available. I mentioned Muhammad Wilkerson from Temple, and he's a player that I really think that's about where he's going to get drafted, whether it be 24 to the New Orleans Saints, 25 to the Seahawks, 26 to the Baltimore Ravens. Those 3 clubs right there is about where I expect Muhammad Wilkerson to go. And we're talking about a couple of clubs there that obviously use some 4-man fronts, but also switch to 3-man fronts at times as well. And so that just speaks to his versatility. Those are a couple of players that immediately jump out at me. And there's been enough concern about the health of the knee of Daquan Bowers, Clemson defensive end, who I really believe is among the top 10 players in this year's draft. Should teams be so scared about his knee that he drops all the way down to Seattle, then he certainly makes a great deal of sense as well.
Yeah, I talked to his trainer and his agent in the last week or so. Apparently he passed a medical recheck in Indianapolis recently. He was doing 10-foot broad jumps when I was down at API in LA. But at the same time, there are other teams that apparently have questions about degenerative arthritis and possible microfracture. It's just hard to tell.
No, it really is. And that's the thing. As long as there's going to be some team out there who obviously gives them a clean bill of health, or at least a clean enough bill of health, if they're going to invest a first-round pick in him. But if he doesn't go in the top 10, the reason is because that some teams are very scared of his knee, and therefore, if he falls out of the top 10, he could fall a lot further than that.
So Muhammad Wilkerson from Temple, we know that Seattle's new D-line coach was at his pro day. It sounds like, all things being equal, with the guys who you're projecting to be around 25, he might be your pick.
He would certainly be among them. I mean, I personally would rank Corey Legit just a notch ahead of him. To me, Corey Legit is the defensive tackle in this year's draft class that could potentially be there for the Seahawks, that is so good, has such upside that you might eschew other needs to go for him. Muhammad Wilkerson, I think, makes the most sense in terms of his versatility and the likelihood that he could actually be there at 25.
Now, given the depth of this D-line class and how many great players there are, Seattle could also get maybe a late first-round talent in the 3rd round. And I know they've been interested in Clemson's Jarvis Jenkins. Who are some guys who you project to go second, obviously not a 3rd-round pick right now, but maybe 2nd to 5th round, who could come in different rotation roles and help right away?
You mentioned one of the big ones, Jarvis Jenkins from Clemson, is a player that when you watch him on tape, he is the reason why Daquan Bowers had some of his nation-leading 15.5 sacks last season. He slid outside, took on 2 blockers, and allowed Daquan Bowers to do little twists and stunts where he ran back inside and just overmatched interior linemen, the guards and centers, with his agility. And so Jarvis Jenkins makes a lot of sense. He is, again, a high-effort type of player who is physical, is productive, and at 6'4", 310 pounds, has the size you're looking for. He's a player I like. Kenrick Ellis, a small school player from Hampton, massive man, 6'4", 345 pounds. He makes a great deal of sense as a defensive tackle, also could slide outside a defensive end. He, again, has some character concerns as well, so that might lead him to slide down the board. So those are 2 players that I'm particularly high on and how they fit in the Seattle scheme as far as they have the ability to play the defensive tackle and slide outside as that 5 technique defensive end.
As many defensive systems as Pete Carroll wants to run, there's a defensive tackle or defensive end for them in this draft class. It could very well be at 25. Most certainly they'll be doing something later. So those are the guys that we've discussed today. Probably every one of them will be somewhere on Seattle's board. This is Doug Farrar with Sports Press Northwest. Rob Rang from NFLDraftScout.com.